They built their fancy neighborhood on my water, so I shut it off. I came back to my father's ranch for a few quiet months, then found a whole neighborhood had buried a pipeline into my creek. When I closed the valve in the middle of a Texas heat wave, 342 homes ran dry and the HOA came for blood. What they didn't know? I owned the very water they'd been living on. The Texas sun hit the valley like a hammer that morning, its heat pressing down through a white sky bleached of mercy. The hills shimmered with dust, cicadas droned like a single long scream, and even the cattle stood motionless under the live oaks. Down by the creek, the only sound was the slow groan of a steel wheel turning. Jake Remy's hands were steady as he twisted the red valve. The old pipe beneath his boots vibrated once, then fell quiet. Across the draw, he could already see the shimmer of water fading from the irrigation ditches that ran toward Cedar Mesa Estates, a bright, manicured subdivision built where his father once cut hay. Sprinklers coughed and died mid-spin, leaving half-soaked lawns steaming in the heat. He leaned against the post, watching the last droplets drip from the spigot. The smell of wet earth gave way to dust and baked cedar. It felt like closing a door that had been left open too long. For weeks, the HOA had run water through his land without so much as a phone call. He had tried the polite way. Letters, calls, one long afternoon of waiting in a marble-floored lobby. None of it mattered. They'd built their comfort on his creek. From up the hill came the sound of tires grinding gravel. A white SUV rolled through the gate without slowing, scattering chickens that fled toward the barn. The vehicle stopped in front of the porch, and out stepped Bethany Whitfield, the HOA president of Cedar Mesa Estates. Her pastel blouse and pressed slacks looked out of place against the dust and heat. She carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Mr. Remy?" she called, striding toward him, high-heeled shoes sinking in the sand. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" Jake wiped his hands on his jeans, the air thick with heat waves. "Managing my water," he said. "You've cut off supply to over 300 homes," she snapped. "Our residents have children, elderly parents. This isn't some private toy for you to tinker with." He met her eyes. They were bright, cold, and unfamiliar, like polished glass. "Funny thing," he said. "I didn't see your name on the deed." Bethany's face flushed beneath her foundation. "We have rights, community infrastructure rights. The pipeline's been in place for years." "Without permission," Jake replied evenly. "You can check the county record." He walked past her toward the porch, boots crunching in the gravel. She followed close behind, the sound of her voice rising with the heat. "This is harassment. I'll call the sheriff, the county, the state if I have to." Jake stopped at the top of the steps and turned. From there he could see the whole valley, the dry ditches snaking toward rows of identical roofs, the faint sparkle of the HOA's decorative lake now lying still. It looked small from here, artificial and shallow. He picked up the sweating glass of iced tea he'd left on the railing. "You might want to ask," he said, quietly, "where your water really comes from." Bethany blinked, unsure whether she'd heard a threat or a fact. A gust of hot wind lifted her papers and scattered them in like pale birds across the yard. Jake didn't move to help. He watched her chase the pages, her heels slipping in the dust, the bright clip of her voice cracking in the heat. Somewhere down the slope, the pipeline groaned again, a hollow echo fading into silence. The air felt lighter without the hum of stolen water. When she finally gathered her papers and straightened her shoulders, she gave him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Remy. Actions have consequences." Jake nodded slowly. "So I've heard." She left in a flurry of gravel and dust, the SUV disappearing toward the neat line of houses that had grown like weeds across the old hayfield. Jake stood in the driveway long after she was gone, the empty sound of wind and insects filling the space she'd left. He knew the phone would ring soon. Lawyers, officials, maybe the sheriff. But for now, the land was quiet. The kind of quiet his father used to call honest silence. He finished his tea, set the glass down, and looked at the sun curling gold off the metal valve at the creek. "Let's see who misses the water first," he muttered. The wind carried the words into the parched horizon, over the low hills and brittle mesquite. When Jake turned back toward the house, the porch boards creaked beneath his boots the same way they had under his father's steps. For a moment, he thought he heard that same quiet humming his dad used to make while sharpening tools, an echo of habit more than sound. 2 weeks earlier, the ranch had felt different. The grass was still a little green from spring rains, and the mornings were cool enough that mist lingered along the creek. Jake had just returned from Austin after settling the last of his father's affairs. He'd told himself it was temporary, a sabbatical, a few months to clean up the place before renting it out. But when he stepped onto that porch for the first time in 10 years, he knew there was no leaving again. His father's old hat still hung on the nail by the door, its brim bleached to a pale gray. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The kitchen window looked out over the same rolling pasture where he'd learned to drive a tractor. It was home, though it felt more like a conversation half-finished. That morning, the mailbox held a single envelope, thick, white, and embossed with gold lettering, Clear Mesa Estates, Homeowners Association. Jake had chuckled, thinking it was junk mail, until he saw his name written neatly in blue ink. Inside was a letter printed on crisp stationery. The Clear Mesa HOA Board would like to welcome you to our community and extend an invitation to our summer meet and greet this Saturday at 6 p.m. at the Lakeside Pavilion. Attendance encouraged for new property owners and adjacent landholders. Below, in elegant cursive, sincerely, Bethany Whitfield, President. His mother, sitting at the kitchen table with her knitting, looked up at the sound of his laugh. "What's funny?" "Apparently we've been promoted," Jake said, waving the letter. "The HOA next door thinks we're part of their little kingdom." Her eyes narrowed behind her glasses. "Your father used to get those too. He always said the only thing worse than drought was neighbors who wanted to own your well." Jake folded the letter, tucking it into his shirt pocket. "Maybe I'll go, no harm in saying hello." But harm had a way of wearing perfume. Saturday came with the shimmer of heat and the hum of generators running air conditioners. The Lakeside Pavilion stood like a glass jewel overlooking the HOA's artificial lake, a small reservoir fed by the same creek that crossed Jake's property. Dozens of guests mingled beneath hanging lights and white canopies, sipping chilled wine from plastic cups. Jake showed up in his cleanest jeans and a denim shirt, his hands still stained with soil. He parked his old Ford between two spotless Teslas and immediately regretted it. Bethany spotted him before he even reached the entrance. Tall, blonde, and deliberate in every motion, she moved through the crowd, with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. Her handshake was firm but cool, her smile a perfect arrangement of teeth and control. "Mr. Remy," she said, voice sugar-sweet. "You must be Jake. We were so sorry to hear about your father. He was quite the character." "That's one word for him," Jake replied. She gestured toward a man standing nearby in a gray suit despite the heat. "This is Preston Hale, our community developer and board advisor. He's spearheading our expansion phase." Preston nodded. "Always nice to meet the neighbors. Beautiful piece of land you've got. We've been hoping to talk about how it fits into our long-term plan." Bethany led Jake to the edge of the deck, where the HOA's lake reflected a fading orange sky. "We'd like to purchase your property," she said, with the casual grace of someone offering a handshake, not a life-changing proposition. "To expand the recreation area, perhaps a nature park or a golf course extension. The offer's generous, I assure you." She named a number that made Jake laugh before he could stop himself. "Ma'am, that wouldn't cover half the fence repairs." Bethany's smile stiffened. Sentiment is admirable, Mr. Remy, but practicality is better. You're a tech man, aren't you? Surely you see the potential value. Jake took a sip of the lukewarm punch they'd handed him and stared out at the lake. The sound of sprinklers ticked softly along the far bank. I do, he said. I just think you're looking at the wrong side of it. Her eyes cooled, calculating. It's always better to work with the HOA than against it. Neighbors who cooperate find life easier. I'll risk the inconvenience, Bachel, he said, setting his cup down. As he turned to leave, she touched his arm lightly. Your father said the same once. Eventually, he understood. The words followed him all the way home, echoing in the cab of his truck. That night, he found his father's old folder in the desk drawer, 15 notices of violation from the same HOA dating back years. Each one accused him of environmental non-compliance, unsightly maintenance, or water mismanagement. His father had kept everyone, annotated in neat handwriting, no jurisdiction, keep for record. Jake sat in the quiet kitchen until the cicadas drowned out thought. He realized this wasn't a new fight. It had only been passed down. When the morning light came, the letter still sat open on the table beside the old hat. He ran his thumb over the embossed logo, feeling the faint ridge of ink. Then he reached for the phone. Marcus, he said when the line picked up, you still got that survey gear? The wind sighed against the window pane like a slow warning, but Jake only smiled. I think it's time we measured a few things. By noon, the sun was a pale coin in a bleached sky. Marcus Reed's dusty red pickup rumbled down the dirt road, the same way it had for 20 years. The man stepped out, wearing his old canvas vest and wide-brim hat, sun lines carved deep around his eyes. He still smelled faintly of motor oil and chewing tobacco. Got your message, Marcus said, unloading a yellow survey tripod from the bed. You fixing fence or starting a war? Not sure yet, Jake answered, pulling on his gloves. But I think somebody drew the wrong lines. They started at the south pasture, where the creek curved lazy and green through the grass. The air was heavy with the buzz of flies and the slow drip of water off the limestone bank. Jake pointed to a stretch of fence where the wire looked new, too new. The posts were bright and freshly sunk, a faint smell of creosote still rising from the wood. See that? He said. Dad replaced nothing down here the last few years. He was too busy fighting off their fines. Marcus crouched, brushing dust from the base of a fence post. Beneath it, the ground had been disturbed recently. Somebody's been digging, deep too. He looked up at Jake. You got the old survey maps? Jake pulled a folded map from his pocket, creased and stained but legible. County line's right here, 5 feet east of the creek. Anything past that's mine. They set up the tripod and took readings, moving slow under the hot wind. The beeping of the rangefinder echoed softly against the canyon wall. When Marcus measured the distance to the first marker, his brows knitted. Jake, you're gonna love this. He pointed at the numbers. They buried something 27 feet inside your property. Jake's stomach tightened. He followed the line of disturbed soil until the pattern curved toward the creek. The faint hum of machinery whispered underfoot, like a heartbeat buried in earth. He knelt, pressing his ear close. The vibration was steady, mechanical. Pipeline, he muttered. Marcus scraped a thin layer of soil away until the glint of metal appeared, dull silver, about the width of a man's thigh. A small pressure gauge protruded from the joint, needle trembling. Well, I'll be damned, Marcus said. They ran it straight from your creek. Jake's jaw clenched. The air tasted metallic, sharp with the scent of oil. They're stealing water. That afternoon, the two men followed the buried line across nearly half a mile of pasture until it disappeared under the fence into the HOA's manicured green belt. Sprinklers on the other side shimmered like tiny fountains of mockery. Jake took pictures, close-ups of the joints, the gauge, the disturbed soil, and the coordinates on Marcus's equipment. "That's enough to start," he said. Marcus kicked at the dirt. "You going to the sheriff?" "Eventually," Jake said. "But first, I want someone who knows the law better than a badge." That evening, as the sky turned red over the hills, he drove into town. The old courthouse still leaned against the square, its limestone facade stained by 100 summers. Across the street, a small office bore a faded sign, "Sarah Coleman, attorney at law, property and water rights." Sarah hadn't changed much since college, still sharp-eyed, still wearing her hair in a quick ponytail like she didn't have time for vanity. She looked up from her desk when Jake stepped in. "Well, if it isn't the engineer who swore he'd never move back to Texas," she said. "Guess the land called collect," he answered, setting his phone on her desk. "Got something you'll want to see." She scrolled through the photos silently, her expression hardening with each image. "This isn't just trespass, Jake. This is theft, and a pretty bold one." She zoomed in on the pressure gauge. "If they're pulling water from your creek, they're violating state code and likely falsifying permits to the county. You need to document everything, every inch of it." "I figured as much," he said. "But I want to handle this right. No shouting, no drama, just facts." Sarah nodded. "Then start by marking your boundaries again. And call me if anyone sets foot past that fence. HOAs like to pretend they have authority everywhere. They don't." When Jake left her office, the evening wind carried the smell of rain that wouldn't come. Lightning flickered far off toward the desert. He drove home slow, headlights slicing through the gathering dust. At the ranch, he parked by the barn and sat for a long time with the engine idling. The night was quiet except for the low hum of the pipeline, steady, constant, a heartbeat that didn't belong. He walked down to the creek, flashlight beam trembling on the rocks. The water looked calm, innocent, slipping past the cottonwoods. He crouched, dipping his hand into the flow. It was cooler than it should have been, drawn faster than nature intended. "You just drilled into the wrong man's land," he whispered to the dark. From the direction of Cedar Mesa, a sprinkler sputtered faintly, then died. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dry dust and cut grass. Jake straightened and looked toward the glow of the subdivision lights flickering beyond the hills. He knew that tomorrow, the real fight would begin. By morning, the sky had turned that pale, merciless blue that promised no rain. The creek ran low and silent, curling like a silver thread through the rocks. Jake loaded the photos, GPS data, and survey notes into a neat folder before heading to town. The evidence was clear, but this wasn't a battle fought in dirt. It was fought in offices with air conditioning and framed certificates on the walls. The Clear Mesa HOA building sat just beyond the lake, a square of mirrored glass and polished stone that gleamed like it had never met dust. Inside, the air smelled of citrus cleaner and new carpet. A young receptionist at the front desk blinked at him, as though a man in work boots didn't belong there. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" "I reckon I do now," Jake said. "Tell Ms. Whitfield that Jake Remy's here about her pipeline." Her polite smile faltered. Within minutes, he was led through a long corridor into a conference room bright with morning light. A table of dark walnut stretched across the room, reflecting the blue sky through the windows. At the far end sat Bethany Whitfield, immaculate as always, a silk blouse the color of fresh cream, a pen poised in her manicured hand. Beside her was Richard Coleman, a silver-haired man with the steady confidence of a practiced attorney. "Mr. Remy," Bethany said warmly, gesturing toward a chair. "We were just discussing you." Jake set the folder on the table and remained standing. "I'm sure you were. Thought I'd save you the trouble." Her smile tightened a fraction. Please sit. No need for hostility. Not hostile, he said. Just direct. Richard leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. My client informs me there's been some misunderstanding about utility infrastructure. These matters are often complex. Boundaries shift. Easements go back decades. We can review the paperwork calmly, if you'd like. Jake flipped open the folder and slid the top photo across the table, the gleam of a metal pipe under his fence line. Looks pretty simple from where I'm standing. Bethany's eyes flicked over the picture without blinking. That's community water management, Mr. Remy. The development has standing rights under the regional cooperative. Funny, Jake said. The county records don't mention that, nor the state water board. You got a copy of this standing right you keep talking about? Her pen stilled. Richard adjusted his glasses. These things take time to locate. I'm sure your father was aware. He cooperated with us in the past. Jake leaned on the table, the old wood creaking under his hand. My father didn't sign a damn thing giving you permission to dig through his pasture. The room went still except for the hum of the air vent. Bethany's smile returned, thin as a blade. Mr. Remy, you seem upset. Perhaps you'd prefer to negotiate rather than accuse. There's still an open offer for your land, if you'd rather avoid complications. There's not enough money in Texas, Jake said, to make me sell a piece of what my father built. Her tone cooled. It's unfortunate, then, that these disputes can become messy. Attorneys, filings, environmental boards. It would be a shame if your operation fell under review. Richard gave a small, rehearsed chuckle. She's just saying litigation isn't pleasant for anyone. Jake gathered his folder. I'm not afraid of paperwork, and if that pipeline isn't out of my land in 72 hours, you'll be seeing more than paperwork. You'll be seeing the sheriff with a trespass warrant. As he turned to leave, Bethany's voice followed him, honeyed and venomous all at once. Your father was stubborn too, Jake. He learned the hard way that the HOA always gets what it needs. He stopped with one hand on the door. Maybe he learned something else too. When Jake stepped outside, the heat hit him like an open oven. Across the parking lot, his reflection shimmered in the glass windows of the building. Dusty boots, denim shirt, sweat darkening his hatband. Behind him, the mirrored facade threw back nothing but sky. He drove home with the windows down, the wind loud enough to drown out his thoughts. By the time he reached the ranch, the sun hung low and red, burning through a haze of dust. His mother met him on the porch, worry shadowing her eyes. They've been after this land for years, she said softly, when he told her what happened. Your daddy said they tried to scare him too. Letters, inspections, even the county assessor showing up uninvited. He said they'd never stop until someone called their bluff. Jake looked out over the pasture, where the fence line shimmered in the distance like a scar. Then I guess it's my turn. That night, thunder rolled far to the west, too distant to bring rain. Jake sat at his desk under the glow of a single lamp, writing out a report of everything. Dates, coordinates, photographs. When he sealed the envelope for Sarah Coleman, his attorney, he paused, staring at his father's handwriting on the old notices pinned above the desk. Keep for record. The next morning, he walked the fence line again. The air was still, and the grass bent as if something moved beneath it. He could feel the faint vibration under his boots, the stolen water running unseen below. 72 hours, he murmured. In the shimmering distance, the rooftops of Cedar Mesa glittered under the punishing sun. The fight had left the office and come home to the dirt. By the next evening, the air was heavy with that strange stillness that comes before trouble. Crickets sang half-heartedly from the dry grass, and the creek moved slow beneath the cottonwoods. Jake sat on his porch, the 72-hour deadline ticking away in his head like a slow metronome. He'd given the HOA every chance to make this right. The clock on the wall read 9:48 when the security feed on his phone flickered. One of the small cameras, hidden inside a birdhouse along the fence, had switched to night vision. The image glowed green and ghostly, showing two pickup trucks idling near the south pasture. Men climbed out, flashlights cutting thin white beams across the dark. Jake muted the sound of the crickets and leaned forward. A voice came through, faint but clear enough through the wireless mic. "Yes, Miss Whitfield," one man said into his phone. "We're here now. Boosting the line 30% like you wanted." Brad Thompson, HOA's facilities manager. He'd seen the man before, clipboard always in hand, wearing that fake contractor's vest that made him look official. Now Brad was knee-deep in stolen water, expanding the very pipeline Jake had warned them about. Jake hit record and watched as the men pried open the dirt with shovels, exposing the dull shine of steel. One of them knelt and adjusted a new pump motor, its low hum blending with the frogs along the creek. When the job was done, they covered it again, tamping the soil flat. Before leaving, Brad turned his flashlight on the camera, unknowingly staring right into it, and said, "She'll be happy." The feed went black. Jake sat back in the chair, the phone still in his hand. He could feel the heat rise under his skin, not from anger exactly, but something sharper, colder. He sent the footage to Sarah Coleman with a single text. "Caught them red-handed. Timestamp 2:17 a.m. Her reply came minutes later. "That's perfect, Jake. Document it all. We'll file tomorrow." But tomorrow came with more than paperwork. By sunrise, a rumor had already reached town. A clerk at the gas station told Marcus that Remy's selling the ranch to some mining company. At the diner, old Mrs. Finley whispered that she'd heard Jake was building a waste treatment plant. The story spread like wildfire, quick and oily, until even the postman asked if it was true. Jake didn't have to guess where it came from. By the time the county inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, wearing mirrored sunglasses, it was almost funny. "Anonymous complaint," the man said. "Possible environmental violation. Need to check your tanks and runoff systems." Jake led him through the barn, patient but curt. The inspector poked around half-heartedly and found nothing. Before leaving, he muttered, "Lot of noise about you in Cedar Mesa. Folks say you're planning to dig new wells." "Folks say a lot of things," Jake said, and watched the man drive off in a cloud of dust. When he returned to the house, he found the front gate hanging crooked. Someone had rammed it with a vehicle hard enough to twist the latch. Near the mailbox, red spray paint screamed across the wooden post. "Sell or dry." His mother stood on the porch, arms folded tight, her silver hair pinned back. "They did this in broad daylight," she said, voice trembling with contained fury. He crouched to examine the dented metal. "Let them enjoy the effort," he said softly. "Water's still running their sprinklers for now." She touched his shoulder. "Jake, they think the power is theirs because they've never met someone willing to outlast them." He looked up, the wind blowing grit against his face. "Then they're about to find out." That night, the ranch was alive with faint movement. The cicadas had gone silent, replaced by the whine of distant engines from across the fence. Jake stood by the window, lights off, watching the far horizon shimmer with the HOA's sodium lamps. Beyond those lights lay rows of lawns, fountains, and tidy streets, an entire world built on borrowed water. He sat down at his father's desk, flipping open the old leather ledger where Tom Remy had once logged rainfall, water pressure, and seasonal usage. Jake added new pages, timestamps, GPS coordinates, copies of photos, every recording. He stapled Sarah's legal notes to the back. The folder had grown thick enough to look like a case file. When Marcus stopped by just before midnight, Jake poured him a cup of coffee so black it looked like oil. "They won't quit," Marcus said. "You know that, right?" Jake nodded. "Neither will I." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the creek flow under the porch light. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yipped, answered by another. Marcus tipped his hat. "You're your father's son, all right." Jake smiled faintly. He always said never to fight the water, just learn where it wants to go. The next morning, the mail brought a letter stamped certified delivery. Inside was a formal response from the HOA's attorney, Richard Coleman again, accusing Jake of obstructing community infrastructure and threatening public access to water. Jake read it twice, then folded it carefully back into the envelope. "So they're calling theft a right now," he muttered. He slipped the letter into his growing file and looked toward the southern hills, where the creek vanished into Cedar Mesa's manicured reflection pool. The same water that once cooled his father's hands after a long day now fed ornamental lawns and fountains. His mother joined him on the porch, setting down 2 glasses of tea. The ice cracked softly in the heat. "They think water makes them powerful," she said, echoing his thoughts. "Show them what real power is." Jake watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, a dull crimson sinking into the hills. "I intend to." By nightfall, he'd made up his mind. No more waiting. The next step wouldn't be reaction, it would be control. The next morning broke warm and breathless, a sky of silver haze and slow-moving clouds. Jake drove to the county records office in Marble Creek, a small town of faded brick and courthouse steps worn smooth by boots. He parked beneath the courthouse oak, the same one his father used to tie his mule to when paying taxes. The air smelled of paper and sweat when he stepped inside. Behind the counter sat Dave Wilson, chairman of the local water management board, a broad man with a sunburned neck and a tie that looked like it had lost every fight it ever fought. "Well, I'll be," Dave said when he saw him. "Didn't expect to see a Remy in here unless it was jury duty." Jake laid his folder on the counter. "I need to see everything you've got on Mission Draw, the spring that feeds the creek." Dave's eyebrows rose. "That little trickle up past Red Hollow? Nobody's touched those records in years. You ranchers been drawing from it since before we started keeping decent files." "Not all of us," Jake said. "Seems my neighbors think it belongs to them." Dave's grin faded. He motioned Jake into a back room lined with filing cabinets and maps yellowed by time. He rolled out a county water grid and tapped the upper corner where a blue line began. Mission Draw Spring, still registered as a public access headwater under the old agricultural cooperative. But the rights lapsed 5 years ago when no one renewed the claim. Jake stared at the map, the lines like veins pulsing toward his land. "So right now, nobody owns it?" Dave leaned back in his chair. "Legally, it's open for reassignment. The board's planning to auction minor rights next month, though they haven't advertised it much. Probably only a couple of old-timers even know." Jake smiled faintly. "Let's keep it that way." He spent the rest of the morning filling out forms, each one stamped with the sharp click of the notary's seal. When the last page slid across the counter, he signed with a firm hand. Remy Water Management, LLC. By the time he walked out into the noon heat, he owned the spring that fed Cedar Mesa's fountains, lawns, and ornamental ponds. The power had shifted quietly, the kind of change that didn't come with noise but with signatures. Back at the ranch, Sarah Coleman arrived in her dusty Jeep, briefcase in hand. "You really did it," she said, eyes bright. "You bought the source." "Not for the bragging rights," he said. "For the record." They spread the documents across the kitchen table. Sarah's finger traced the lines on the official survey map. "By Texas water law, first appropriation means first in time, first in right. You control outflow and management now. As long as you file the proper maintenance and environmental forms, you can regulate flow legally." Jake nodded. "Then we'll do it by the book." For 2 days, a hired engineering crew came up the hill to install the new valve at the spring head, a gleaming steel wheel connected to a remotely controlled regulator box. The sound of welding echoed off the canyon walls, the smell of hot metal mixing with cedar and clay. When the system was complete, the men wiped their hands and packed up, leaving Jake standing before a small control panel fixed into the stone. "Looks like something out of NASA," Marcus said, watching. "Or Judgment Day," Jake replied, pressing a button that made the valve hum and spin. The creek below trembled with the new pulse of pressure. He documented every step: photos, permits, maintenance logs, even the receipt for the engineering work. Each file copied to a flash drive and sent to Sarah's office for safekeeping. 3 days later, when the afternoon temperature hit 103 degrees, he sat beneath the porch awning, iced tea sweating in his hand, watching the heat shimmer over the hills. The air smelled of baked stone and dust, the kind that sticks to your skin like memory. At exactly noon, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the small remote control, and pressed the red button. Down in the canyon, a deep, muffled groan rolled through the earth. The old creek narrowed, slowed, and then steadied at half its usual strength. Across the valley, the ornamental fountains of Cedar Mesa sputtered like dying breaths. Jake leaned back in his chair, eyes hidden behind his hat brim. "Time for them to feel the drought they built," he whispered. Within hours, text messages began buzzing his phone. Marcus, Sarah, even the clerk from the courthouse. "Whole neighborhood's dry," one read. "News vans already out front." By evening, Jake stood on the porch watching a string of headlights weaving down the county road. Residents of Cedar Mesa, their SUVs kicking up dust as they drove past the ranch. Some slowed to glare. Others honked angrily. Jake didn't flinch. He'd posted a notice on the community board earlier that day. Calm, factual, airtight in legal phrasing. Maintenance and regulation of private water source under Title 30, Texas Administrative Code. Temporary restriction for inspection and calibration. No unauthorized use permitted. When Sarah called that night, her tone was equal parts disbelief and admiration. "You realize what you just did, right?" "Followed the law," he said simply. "Sure," she replied. "But you also made 300 people realize who's been paying for stolen water." Outside, the crickets had gone silent, replaced by the faint hiss of wind pushing through dry grass. The sky glowed orange over the subdivision's dark outline. Somewhere out there, Bethany Whitfield was probably pacing her kitchen, trying to understand how a man she'd dismissed as a stubborn rancher had turned off her world with a single button. Jake set down his glass and looked toward the spring-fed hills. "They wanted control," he murmured. "Now they'll see what it feels like." "Was at." Mission Draw hummed once more, sealing the line tight. By the second day, the valley was restless. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Lawns in Cedar Mesa, once emerald and precise, now turned brittle and pale. The fountains at the HOA's gate sat frozen, half-filled basins gone green with algae in the relentless sun. Sprinklers coughed dust. The air smelled faintly of burnt grass and chlorine. Jake drove into town for supplies and saw it firsthand. Pickup trucks and sedans lined at the hardware store, residents scrambling for garden hoses and jugs of water. A hand-painted sign taped to the HOA bulletin board read, "Community crisis, water pressure low, volunteers needed." By noon, the news trucks had arrived. A local reporter stood in front of the lifeless lake, her hair plastered by heat, speaking into the camera. "Residents say their taps have run dry for over 24 hours, she announced. Officials blame a technical issue upstream, but some point fingers at neighboring ranch owner Jake Remy. Jake watched from his truck, parked under the shade of an oak. He didn't hide, didn't flinch. He'd expected this. On screen, Bethany Whitfield appeared beside the reporter, immaculate despite the heat. Her voice dripped with measured outrage. "This isn't about paperwork or boundaries," she said. "This is about humanity. Families are suffering. Children can't bathe. Elderly residents are at risk in triple-digit heat, all because one man decided to play God with our community's water. Jake turned off the radio and started the engine. When he returned home, his mother was sitting by the window, knitting needles still. "She's on television again," she said quietly, "calling you a menace." Jake smiled faintly. "That's good. Means she's scared." He walked out to the barn and opened his laptop. A few keystrokes and a collection of files popped open. Footage from the birdhouse cameras, time-stamped, clear as daylight. Brad Thompson and his crew digging under moonlight. Audio of Brad's call with Bethany. Copies of HOA financial statements Sarah had uncovered. Records showing water infrastructure fees charged to homeowners for the very pipeline buried in Jake's land. He uploaded them all to a cloud drive, then sent the link to Sarah. Her reply came minutes later. "You sure you're ready for this? Once it's public, there's no going back." Jake typed 2 words. "Post it." That evening, as the temperature sank to a bearable 95, Jake sat on the porch watching the sunset set fire to the sky. The sound of gravel carried from the road, a caravan of vehicles approaching. SUV headlights flared across the fence, followed by the harsh squawk of a megaphone. Bethany's voice rang through the heat. "Turn on our water, Mr. Remy. You're violating the law and endangering lives." Jake stood slowly, dusting off his jeans. Behind Bethany, a crowd of about 50 residents gathered, their faces red from sun and anger. Some held signs, scrawled in marker. "Water is a right. End the hostage crisis." A few just looked confused and tired, clutching bottles of store-bought water. From the porch, Jake called out calmly, "This is private property. You're trespassing. Go home." Bethany's face flushed. "You can't hold an entire neighborhood hostage, Remy." Jake raised his phone, the red light of its camera blinking. "You might want to save that line for the evening news. They'll enjoy the replay." "Do you think this makes you a hero?" she shouted. "You're destroying this community." He stepped closer to the fence, voice steady as stone. "No, ma'am. I'm exposing one." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then murmurs rippled through the crowd. One man shouted, "He's lying!" Another, a weary woman clutching her toddler, whispered, "But is he?" And then, like a spark, the whispers grew. A young resident, Mike Hansen, stepped forward. "Bethany," he called, "what about the water fees? We've been paying extra for a year. Where's that money going?" Bethany's jaw tightened. "Mike, this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," he said, louder now. "You told us we'd have water independence. That's what those fees were for. So why are we suddenly bone dry?" Jake didn't need to add anything. The silence spoke for him. Just then, the reporter's van pulled up, camera rolling. She caught the tail end of the argument. Bethany red-faced, residents restless. The lens turned toward Jake, still standing at his fence line, dust shimmering in the twilight. "Mr. Remy," the reporter called, "do you admit to cutting off the community's water supply?" Jake looked straight into the camera. "No, ma'am. I regulated water flow on property I legally own. The same water that's been stolen from this land for years. I've filed every permit, every report. Ask your HOA president where her paperwork is." The crowd murmured louder. The camera zoomed in on Bethany, who began to stammer something about pending documentation. Mike Hansen spoke again, voice breaking through the confusion. "We deserve answers." The air trembled with tension. Then, as if on cue, Jake held up a sheet of paper. "You want answers? Here's the county deed." He waved it once, then tucked it back into his shirt pocket. "I suggest you start reading before shouting." The crowd began to disperse, their anger deflating into uneasy silence. Bethany glared, eyes glinting with fury. "This isn't over," she hissed. Jake nodded once. "You're right. It's just getting started." By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge, the valley was quiet again. Only the faint hum of cameras remained, documenting every moment. Later that night, Jake checked his phone. Sarah's message flashed. "You're trending on 3 stations. Public opinion's turning." He set the phone down beside his hat, exhaled slowly, and listened. To the cicadas resume their song. In the distance, he could almost hear the hollow wheeze of empty pipes beneath Cedar Mesa. The heat wave had broken something larger than a water main. It had broken their illusion of control. By dawn, the county courthouse parking lot was full. News vans, pickup trucks, residents clutching water bottles and handwritten signs. The city had called an emergency mediation to resolve the water access dispute. Jake arrived early, dressed clean but plain, pressed denim, boots polished, hat in hand. He didn't come to argue. He came to finish what had begun years before. Inside, the air conditioning blasted cold enough to sting. The council chamber gleamed with polished oak tables, state flags drooping in the corners. Mayor Robert Hayes, gray-haired and steady-eyed, sat at the head of the table. Beside him were 2 attorneys from the city and one man, Jake. Jake already knew, Dave Wilson from the Water Board, his face unreadable. On the opposite side sat Bethany Whitfield, immaculate as ever in a pastel suit that matched her calm, rehearsed expression. Richard Coleman, her lawyer, shuffled through a thick binder, and at the back, a handful of HOA residents murmured quietly, curiosity outweighing loyalty. "Let's begin," said Mayor Hayes, his gavel thudding once. "We're here to address allegations of property encroachment and unlawful obstruction of water infrastructure. Mr. Remy, Miss Whitfield, thank you both for coming." Jake nodded once. "Appreciate the chance to clear the record." Bethany smiled as if she'd already won. "Likewise, Mayor." Richard opened his folder with a theatrical rustle. "Your Honor, my client holds documented easement rights allowing Clear Mesa Estates access to the water supply adjoining Mr. Remy's property. This agreement was signed 2 years ago by Mr. Remy's father." He slid a paper across the table, crisp and clean, a signature flowing at the bottom in ink Jake knew too well. Jake didn't flinch. He simply looked to Sarah Coleman, seated quietly beside him. She had come prepared. Without a word, she reached into her own folder and drew out another document, aged, faded, but stamped by the county clerk's office. "Mayor," Sarah said calmly, "we've verified this claim. The so-called easement is a forgery. The handwriting doesn't match verified samples from Mr. Tom Remy's estate, and the notary listed here, Paul Glenn, retired 5 years before this signature was dated. The county seal is photocopied." The room fell into murmurs. Bethany's smile trembled for the first time. Jake leaned forward. "My father never signed anything giving you rights to our creek. He spent half his life fighting off your notices and fines. You're drinking from a well he never offered." Richard cleared his throat. "Even if there was a clerical error, the community's reliance on this water establishes de facto usage." Dave Wilson interrupted, his tone sharp. "De facto doesn't override trespass, counselor. And we have more than just signatures to talk about." He turned on a projector. The screen behind the mayor flickered to life, displaying spreadsheets, audit logs, and expense reports, each line bearing the name Clear Mesa HOA. The first slide read, "Water Infrastructure Assessment Fund." Rows of numbers filled the screen. Quarterly fees charged to homeowners, amounts totaling over $200,000. Next to it, a column labeled Expenditures was alarmingly blank. Dave looked up. "We've been investigating unusual payments under Clear Mesa's water fund. Large withdrawals with no invoices. Residents paid for upgrades that never happened." In the back, someone whispered, "That's our money?" Sarah handed the mayor another folder. The missing funds were traced to an account under the name of Whitfield Development Services, a shell LLC controlled by Ms. Whitfield herself. The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. Bethany's lips parted, her eyes darting to Richard, who suddenly found great interest in his notes. "That's absurd," she said weakly. "Those were legitimate administrative expenses." Jake met her gaze, voice even but cutting. "You've been stealing water and their money. You called me a criminal, but the only one breaking laws here is sitting across the table." The room erupted, reporters typing, residents gasping, flashbulbs popping. The mayor slammed his gavel. "Order! Order!" When the noise subsided, Mayor Hayes exhaled heavily. "Miss Whitfield, these are serious allegations. Until verified, I'm ordering a temporary suspension of your HOA's control over water management operations. The city will appoint an interim board." Bethany's composure cracked. "You can't do that? This is a private community matter." "Not anymore," the mayor said. "You made it public when you forged state documents." Jake could almost feel the air lighten. Years of pressure, of quiet disrespect and stolen rights, seemed to exhale through the room. Still, he didn't gloat. He simply watched the truth spread like water finding its level. Outside, the heat pressed against the courthouse windows. Reporters cornered the HOA residents as they left, demanding comments. Inside, Bethany slumped back in her chair, her perfect posture gone, her voice reduced to a whisper. "This isn't over, Remy," she said, eyes sharp as glass. "You think you've won, but I've survived worse." Jake picked up his hat and stood. "You've survived because no one ever fought back. That part's over too." He stepped into the blinding light of afternoon, camera flashes flickering across his face. Sarah joined him on the courthouse steps. "You just made the evening news, Jake." "Let them talk," he said. "It's time the truth had a microphone." Behind them, the courthouse door shut with a heavy click. Somewhere beyond the hills, the dry creek waited for judgment, and so did everyone who'd tried to own it. For the first time in months, Jake slept soundly that night. The air carried a rare coolness, and the hum of the crickets returned to the valley. The next morning, the headlines spoke louder than any verdict could. HOA under investigation for forgery and missing funds. Sarah called before sunrise, her voice bright for once. "The interim board's already moving to negotiate. Bethany's done." Jake smiled, standing on the porch as the first light touched the pasture. Then maybe the land can breathe again. But peace, he was learning, never came without a test. 3 days later, a certified envelope arrived in his mailbox, sealed with a bright green label. State Environmental Protection Division. Urgent notice. Jake tore it open. Inside was a brief letter full of legal phrases, but one line cut through it all. Due to preliminary findings of chemical contamination in Mission Draw Creek, all water flow is to be suspended pending investigation. He stared at the words for a long time. Then he walked down to the creek, his boots stirring dust instead of mud. The water shimmered under the noon light, clear as glass, rippling lazily through the reeds. There was no sign of contamination, no sheen, no smell, no dead fish. Yet by that afternoon, news vans were back at the gates. The local station's anchor stood beneath her parasol, microphone in hand. Sources within the Environmental Division say hazardous chemicals have been detected downstream of the Remy Ranch, she said gravely. Tests suggest possible industrial pollutants. Jake turned off the TV before his mother could see. "It's her," he said aloud. Sarah arrived an hour later, already holding her phone to her ear. "I've talked to the state lab," she said. "The samples were collected by an inspector named Thomas Green. You know that name?" Jake nodded grimly. "He's the one who investigated me before. Works hand in glove with the HOA." Sarah's tone sharpened. "He's not on the official rotation for this district, which means someone called him in off the record." By dusk, the mayor himself was on the phone. "Jake," Hayes said carefully, "this is serious. The division wants to shut off your water completely until the contamination is cleared. I'm sending a city engineer tomorrow to verify. Just be ready." "Ready for what?" Jake asked. "For another storm," Hayes said, and hung up. That night, Jake and Marcus walked the length of the creek by flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, glinting off smooth rocks and pools of water that reflected the moon. Then, near the point where the creek crossed into Cedar Mesa, Marcus stopped short. "Jake," he said, voice low, "look at this." A thin, iridescent film floated across the surface, catching the light like spilled gasoline. The smell hit them next, chemical, sharp, and out of place. Jake crouched, his heart sinking. "They planted it," he said quietly, "right on the boundary." The next morning, he called Sarah. "Get the lab in Dallas," he said. "Independent testing, full chain of custody." By midday, a small team of technicians arrived with sealed sample kits, wearing gloves and badges. They collected water from both sides of the property line, carefully labeling each bottle. The air buzzed with the sound of locusts and the low rumble of news helicopters circling overhead. That evening, Jake stood on the porch with his mother, watching the flicker of red lights from the vans parked along the highway. "Feels like déjà vu," she said softly. "Every time we get close to peace, they find another way." "Not this time," he replied. "This time, we've got proof before the spin." 2 days later, the results came back. Sarah arrived at dawn, dust still clinging to her shoes. "The samples upstream and from your property, completely clean," she said. "The only contamination was downstream, inside Cedar Mesa boundaries. Industrial solvents, synthetic hydrocarbons." Jake exhaled, shoulders loosening for the first time in days. "Any idea where it came from?" Sarah's eyes hardened. "From someone who bought those chemicals last week. We traced the purchase, signed by Thomas Green, delivered to a private address on Lakeview Drive. Guess who lives there?" "Bethany," Jake said. Sarah nodded. "She's desperate and sloppy." By noon, Sheriff McKay pulled up the drive, his cruiser raising a swirl of dust. He stepped out, hat in hand, eyes solemn. "Jake," he said, "you've got friends in the mayor's office. They pushed the DA to take this seriously. We've got a warrant to search Green's office and Whitfield's property." The raid unfolded before sunset. Jake didn't go, he didn't need to. He waited on the porch while the orange light bled out of the sky. In the distance, sirens echoed faintly, followed by the muffled buzz of radio chatter. Then, finally, Sarah's voice on the phone. "They found everything. Green's got falsified reports and a check from Bethany. In her garage they found the same chemicals, receipts dated 3 days before the test. It's over." Jake sat down slowly, letting the words sink in. His mother came out, wiping her hands on a towel. "Well?" she asked. "They tried to poison the truth," he said quietly, "and they ended up poisoning themselves." That night, the valley slept easy for the first time in a long while. The wind off the creek was cool again, carrying the faint smell of cedar and wild mint. Across the dark fields, lights from Cedar Mesa flickered uncertainly, as if unsure whether to burn or fade. By morning, the headlines were everywhere. HOA president arrested in water fraud and environmental crime case. Bethany Whitfield's mugshot stared from every screen. Once perfect, now hollow-eyed, mascara streaked. Sheriff McKay's statement was calm and measured. The law may flow slow, but it always reaches level ground. Jake read the words twice, folded the paper, and placed it beside his father's old hat. The creek outside whispered against the stones, free again, patient and timeless. Weeks passed, and the world that had once been split by fences began to soften. The morning air, carried the scent of rain that finally came. Steady, cleansing, unhurried. The parched earth drank deeply, and for the first time in years, the sound of running water filled the valley without guilt. Down in Cedar Mesa, things changed too. The HOA board resigned in silence, their spotless office now a hollow shell of glass and polished stone. A handwritten notice taped to the door read, "Closed pending investigation." The subdivision's once proud lake had lowered by several feet, its fountain removed, its waters now flowing in balance again through the same creek that ran past Jake's land. On a mild morning, the new HOA interim president, Lisa Thompson, drove up Jake's dirt road with her husband and a small group of neighbors. Their car kicked up a trail of dust that glowed like gold in the sunlight. They stepped out carefully, holding a folder between them, uncertainty softening their steps. Lisa took off her sunglasses. "Mr. Remy," she said, "we came to thank you." Jake wiped his hands on a rag, setting down the wrench he'd been using to fix the gate. "For cutting off your water?" he asked, half smiling. "For showing us who really stole it," she said. "We've read the court records. We've seen the evidence. The new board wants to make things right." She handed him the folder. Inside were fresh documents, a signed apology, a fair contract for shared water access, and a commitment to help restore the damaged stretch of creek. "We want to pay what's owed," she said quietly, "and we'd like to help rebuild what was lost." Jake looked at the papers, then at the faces in front of him. No anger now, just humility. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You owe it to this land. Keep it honest, and we'll all have enough." A breeze swept through the valley, stirring the tall grass. Lisa nodded, eyes glassy. "We'll do better this time." Later that afternoon, Jake and Marcus Reed walked the property line, checking the repaired fences. The new water regulators gleamed in the sun, steady and balanced. The grass near the creek had already grown lush again, and dragonflies darted between cattails. "Hard to believe this place was a battleground," Marcus said. Jake nodded. "Land remembers, Marcus, but so does water." They reached the new wooden sign staked near the creek's bend. Fresh paint spelled out the words, "Mission Draw Conservation Trail," in honor of Tom Remy. A small group of schoolchildren from town came that weekend to plant saplings along the bank. Jake helped them dig the holes, his hands steady and sure. His mother sat nearby in her chair, wrapped in a shawl despite the warm sun. She smiled as the children's laughter carried through the air. "Your father would have liked this," she said softly. Jake looked out over the glinting water. He always said the creek was, stubborn. Maybe he meant us. That evening, as the last of the children left and the valley quieted again, he sat alone by the water. The sky burned with colors too bright to name. Orange, gold, the faint blush of rose. He could hear the hum of insects, the far-off bark of a dog, the steady rhythm of life finding its way back. Sarah Coleman arrived just as twilight settled. She carried a manila envelope, settlement check, final paperwork, legal closure. But she didn't hand it over right away. Instead, she sat beside him on the smooth rock, their shoulders brushing lightly. "It's done," she said. Bethany pleaded guilty, green too. The county's returning every cent of those fraudulent fees to the residents. Jake exhaled slowly. Guess justice finally caught up. "It usually does," she said. "It just takes someone stubborn enough to wait for it." He chuckled, low and tired. "Then I guess I was born for it." They watched the creek shimmer under the moonlight, a ribbon of silver winding through the dark. The water ran free, unhurried, whispering its eternal song. Somewhere out there, the headwaters he'd bought and fought for sent their steady gift down to the valley, through the fences, beneath the bridges, past the lawns that had once stolen what they didn't own. Jake picked up a smooth stone, turned it in his hand, then tossed it into the current. Ripples spread wide, catching the moonlight before fading into calm. "Funny thing about water," he said quietly. "It remembers where it's been. It forgives, but it never forgets." Sarah smiled. "Neither do we." As the night deepened, the ranch lights flickered on, warm and steady. The wind carried the smell of cedar and damp soil. The fight, the noise, the years of tension, gone now, washed clean by patience and truth. The camera of life seemed to pull back from the creek, rising slowly over the hills, showing the valley below, the restored pastures, the silver line of water glinting under the stars, and one man standing beside it, quiet, resolute, at peace. In the end, it wasn't revenge that defined him. It was restoration. Jake tipped his hat to the flowing water and turned toward home. The creek whispered after him, steady and sure, just as it always had. If you've ever had to fight for what's yours, you know, justice doesn't come easy, but it's worth every drop of sweat. Drop a justice in the comments if you'd have stood your ground like Jake did. And if stories of land, grit, and quiet revenge speak to you, go on and subscribe. There's plenty more truth waiting down the road.